Venkat, it's great to have you here. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me, David.
So I want to start by talking about your experience in academia because you did a stint there. Can you tell me about that time in your life and what your perception of academia
Yeah,
was then?
it was. So I finished my PhD in December of 2003. So this was at University of Michigan in systems and control theory. And it was, I would say my thesis was about 50-50 theory and MATLAB based simulation work. And this was like, just about 3 or 4 years before the maker movement and all that stuff. So this was the period when university aerospace labs were doing the original, like, quadcopter research and what came before the Arduino. So these were like at the Michigan lab I was in, there's like $100,000 project to do like fixed wing drones. And then when I went for my postdoc, so that's where I was at Cornell in Raf de Andrea's lab. So Raf de Andrea is a famous robo soccer and drone researcher. So I spent 2.5 years in his lab, 2004 to 2006. And his lab had not only a world beating robotics soccer team, they won this championship like 6 times, but it also had one of the original quadcopter research labs. So this thing was huge, like, 6 feet across,
Mm-hmm.
probably cost $500,000 in DARPA funding or whatever. And it's amazing to see now you can get them for like $100, so the cheapest ones, right? And a couple of other things worth mentioning from Cornell. I worked for RAF, but the next door lab was run by Hod Lipson. And Hod was one of the early pioneers of 3D printing. And he put Cornell has this huge collection of 19th century mechanisms by a guy named Franz Rollo.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, made out of metal. So 19th century machine work. He scanned the whole thing and put it up as like 3D modeling files. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the story of my experience in grad school and as a postdoc is I was in the transition era between, I would say, old school military industrial complex style research. My own PhD was funded by NASA and then my postdoc by AFOSR. So huge $1 billion projects, a lot of the context you worked in was like, all right, the background is Lockheed and Boeing are going to actually build the things. The
Mm-hmm.
professors in the labs are going to like actually do like modeling and theoretical and computational research on these like $1 billion project ideas. Like my PhD was on interferometric space telescopes. So these are like
Mm-hmm.
Hubble-like telescopes that would be in orbit and would use interferometry to like synthesize virtual larger telescopes. So like, imagine two Hubbles flying like 10 kilometers apart. You effectively have a 10-kilometer wide mirror, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is an actual project that might fly in the next 20, 30 years. But you can imagine the context of that. It's like you're doing these papers and theories work on these multi-billion-dollar projects that might happen in 2060.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, the young undergrads who were coming in, who I was teaching as a graduate assistant, they were like much more into this tinkering mode. And it got more and more that way. And by the time I left academia in 2006 after my postdoc, it was full blown in that mode. Like it was still not yet Arduino time or cheap 3D printer time,
Mm-hmm.
but all the kids were better at hands-on work. They could program microcontrollers. So I felt like suddenly I was like, I suddenly feel like an imposter. I no longer think I'm a good researcher. These kids are much better researchers than me. I'm here doing simulation in MATLAB and theorem proving with pure math that is like about unrealistic 2040 telescopes. So it was kind of like an interesting time to be in academia, the transition between like military
Yeah.
industrial style to maker movement style approaches
Yeah.
to research. So yeah, that was my
So,
experience. Then I moved to
so
Xerox into industrial research. Yeah.
got it. Okay, cool. Because I was trying to figure out what so there was the Xerox step too, because I'm trying to think about like the origins of your discontent, like what were the seeds that you were seeing that kind of thought, I need to go, I need to go on my own here.
So that actually didn't happen. So there was
Huh.
no discontent as such. like initially I started off with my first PhD advisor. We didn't get along and I broke up with him like halfway through, signed
Yeah.
on with a new advisor with whom I got along really well. And my PhD was an extremely positive experience. I loved it. I loved everything
Cool.
about it. And my postdoc as well. I got along really well with both my PhD and postdoc advisors. And I kind of enjoyed the actual research work I did and the student teaching, grad student teaching, and mentoring of undergrads that I did. The
Mhm.
part I think I didn't like was the degree to which, and I think the link you sent me speaks to this, the degree to which everything was driven by like grant chasing and funding on the one
Mhm.
hand. And I think peer-reviewed publishing is seriously, seriously broken. So we can talk
Mhm.
both about like, I think it'll be better to talk about some of this towards the end. But the brief headline there is the grant funding. Like to give you a typical example, towards the end of my postdoc, when I was applying for tenure track positions, and I ended up getting one at like a crappy place I didn't want to go to, and all the others like I think I put in 10 applications, got 9 rejects, and one I didn't want accept. So and a couple more second postdocs. So I was like, I'm going to industry now.
Yeah.
But one of the last things I did was participate in writing this big grant proposal in collaboration with Lockheed Martin. I think some people at USC. It was 2 universities and Lockheed Martin, and it was something called the DARPA Coordinators Program.
Mhm.
So the
Mhm.
BAA, which is the Broad Agency Announcement, was this really ambitious, 100 people are going to work on this and we're going to throw $1 billion at it. And the
Mhm.
idea was like, uh, personal, think of it as personal digital assistance for soldiers on the battlefield. That's
Mhm.
basically what it was. And some of the stuff that came out of it did end up becoming like Siri and digital assistants that ended up in like commercial tech. But
Mhm.
that was one of the last things I did, and it did leave a bad taste in my mouth. I'm like, this is not the way for research to be run. It should be much smaller scale, cottage industry type, where you can actually kind of like work on things that actually look research and lab scale, and not things that I don't know, have these big ambitions but end up being 90% bureaucratic administration of like proposal review meetings, going and telling some 3-star general what your progress has been, talking to people
Mhm.
who don't understand what the hell you're doing. It was like
Mhm.
everything about this is fucked. So
Mhm.
that was
Mhm.
one discontent. That it wasn't a personal discontent, like I didn't have any angst about it. It was like a almost a neutral observation about the state of play. And the
Yeah.
other was peer-reviewed publishing. I just did not enjoy it at all. Like when I
Yeah.
compare it to when I became a blogger later, it was like pulling teeth constantly. Like I ended up writing maybe 3 journal papers, a few book chapters, maybe a dozen conference papers. And
Mhm.
every single time the experience was painful. I felt like I was butting heads with anonymous reviewers who didn't get what I was saying and were like perversely trying to like, I don't know, the social dynamic was very bad. So I was like,
Mhm.
once I'm done with my last paper, I'm never doing peer review again. I'm just going to
Mhm.
do blogging. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's sort of the situation at the end of 2007 when I finally published my last journal paper and I was like, done.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, that's interesting. So I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but I come from this world not from a science or engineering background. I studied business when I was in college because I thought the most interesting people I knew were entrepreneurs, and I thought that, oh, that's the right path for me. Anyways, I came into the science world, into ocean science in particular and engineering, kind of through the side door, and so all of it to me is very foreign. Like
Mhm.
it's like, well, why are it's like the have you ever read the book Bruno Latour's Laboratory Life?
No, but I've heard of it. Yeah.
So he's this kind of sociologist who comes and goes, it seems like they care a lot about these instruments and they care a lot about these papers. And so that's kind of the perspective I've had in the scientific um, arena, is kind of being this amateur and being like, well, why are you doing that? And the thing that is so striking to me is 2 things that you just brought up. One is, wow, everyone is spending so much of their time on grant proposals and grant writing, and it's invisible, right? Like you can't go and read grant proposals, and you can't go and like learn what people set out to do, and you don't know about their costs, and it's this invisible part of the scientific process that nobody seems to care that it's invisible. The second thing is this obsession with papers and bibliometrics and this kind of obsessive career orientation. So those are things I noticed. And then the other thing that I noticed, and this is kind of related to the recent tweet storm you had around scientific instrumentation, was I think there are these massive blind spots that big science, like science is getting bigger and better in a lot of amazing ways. I just watched the edge of all we know about the black hole images that they're trying to take. It's amazing stuff. But big science has these real blind spots. And we found one of those with OpenROV, which was, we wanted to build this robot because we wanted to explore this cave and whatnot. And we just shared it. And we just like tapped into this energy of people who were also interested in having this low cost device. And also people who had kind of genuinely interesting questions and reasons for wanting that low cost device. And so one of the things that I've learned over the past 10 years is I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think, your kind of response to a lot of the tweets were like, well, that's just, it was kind of twofold. One is citizen science has been kind of co-opted by the academy to like just get people into like data gathering mode. And I think that is like so sad because citizen science had all of this potential to be this true amateur renaissance. And it feels like it's kind of gotten co-opted by academics and squandered.
Yeah, I would put a slightly more positive and slightly more negative spin on it. I don't think there was any malicious intent. It's like genuine excitement on both sides. Like you've got people who are not insiders in the academy getting like a little bit awestruck and hero worshipy about people with PhDs in university labs. And on the other side, you've got these people who are genuinely like setting aside the cynics who just do grant chasing. I would say 90% of people in academia are genuinely interested people who love their subjects. And when they see a bright young person who wants to do something, they're excited and they're like, all right, you don't know all this stuff you need to know, but I want to do my best to help you do the little you can do. And you end up unwittingly in this sort of slightly patronizing mode, which is inevitable with the power differential. Like I was in the thread you're mentioning, I was going back and forth with a professional astronomer. Now, I'm an amateur astronomer, and at one point I was considering doing a PhD in astrophysics. So I'm better educated than most on astronomy and more able to hold up my end in an astronomy conversation. But and I have a PhD in a different discipline where I had to deal with telescopes as an adjacency, like, building telescopes. So I was sort of talking to, his name was, I think, Gregory, more as an equal, but even there, it was like palpable as an outsider, even though sort of a slightly prepped outsider, it was clear that he knows a shit ton more about astronomy than me. And if we had to actually talk about astronomy per se, he would have 100 times more interesting things to say than me, simply because he knows a lot more. But despite that sort of power differential, and by the way, this only gets worse if you're talking a high school kid who's just gotten their first telescope and doesn't know anything. But despite the power differential, I don't think the primary value of people doing sort of quote unquote outsider science is either filling in the gaps, as you put it, because that inevitably takes you towards incrementalism, nor is it sort of doing the easy low-end data gathering stuff. I think of it as the highest value non-institutional science actors can do, whether they're like high school kids or experienced people who've gotten disillusioned and left the academy, is actually being crackpots. Like literally crackpottery is the value that outsiders bring to institutional science. And yes, 99 out of 100 times, the crackpot who emails the academic scientists and says, hey, here's my grand unified theory of everything, I've solved all your problems, they're going to be actual crackpots. Like there's a wonderful woman, Sabine Hossenfelder, I think is her name. She's a physicist at the, I think, Max Planck Institute or something. She actually literally made a career of like consulting with crackpot, especially engineers who thought they'd solved everything in physics, and would mail her physics theories of everything. And she would like say, yeah, you screwed up this math, this is wrong, blah, blah, blah. And she made like fun money out of it. And she's written a book about science, which is on my reading pile. So I would say what she deals with is like 99 out of 100 times, or maybe 98 out of 100 times. 1 out of 100 times, you get somebody like Stephen Wolfram, who's like a legit genius, could be a crackpot, and half his theories are insane, but you can't dismiss him with a wave of your hand. He's like an outsider who built Mathematica and Wolfram Research, one of the best AI engines. So even though half the time, I think he's talking nonsense and people do like real criticisms of him. So Cosma Shalizi has a really good takedown of Wolfram, so on the critical side. But he's one of the 98th person type person, like, a genius who has like a very non-trivial chance of stumbling upon some truly important stuff. And he's done that. Like a new kind of science is like a non-traditionally published, non-peer reviewed, like 2-inch thick, fat book, but it has like, at least I would say 5 or 6 pages of genuinely important things there. That's like, and he's like, too full of himself and self-important, and he overrates what he's done. But like, rule 110 being an Turing complete automaton, that's an important finding. But the 100th person is what I'm interested in, which is the unschooled person who may just have a high school education, has no idea what they're doing, and might like make lots of weird blunders and like have crackpot theories, but they have a chance of like truly blowing it away by being the contrarian outside of science. And an example of that I would say is Jack Parsons, who was, I don't know if you've heard the name. He was this crackpot mystic / rocket pioneer who built some of the earliest liquid fueled and solid fuel boosters in the, I think, 50s, 60s. And he was a close friend of L. Ron Hubbard, the Scientology guy. He was into some weird sex cult thing, but he was effectively the founder of what is now JPL. Like literally, Jack Parsons is this complete outsider, self-taught rocketry engineer. I think he was actually like a blue-collar plumbing type guy or something. I don't know what he was, like a technician basically. But he basically created what is now JPL. Another one is, I think, one of SpaceX's early founders is another guy who was like working on a rocket engine in his garage. So these stories are all over the place. So that's the value. And when you have like, a famous professor with a PhD in 30 years and like a chair at a university, and they've done like great work. Don't get me wrong. I'm not like creating like a negative cartoon. So this person could have done fantastic work. And they talk to like, say, an 18-year-old hacker who dropped out of high school and is playing with some weird rocket engine. That dynamic should be on the basis of like 2 dimensions. One dimension is, I'm the senior professor and I can tell you a lot you don't know. But 2, you're the outsider crackpot who might do like remarkably weird inside things that I cannot do. Not fill in my gaps, not do like my scut work and collect my data for me, but truly original things that I'm too blind to see. And actually, Jack Parsons is a good example because he found a guy like that. He found a PhD student at Caltech whose advisor was, I think, Theodore von Karman is his name, one of the early sort of academic luminaries of aerodynamics research. And von Karman saw that Jack Parsons was doing something really clever, and that was the right kind of relationship. So you want a lot more of that. I think that's the right way to do, citizen science.
Yeah, so I'm with you 100% on like making room for weird and kind of increasing the optionality and the serendipity of new ideas. I'm totally with you on that. There's 2 other aspects that I think are valuable that kind of don't get talked about, and I want your opinion on both because these are half-baked thoughts after 10 years of doing this, and so it could just be I could be biased. The first is, my sense is another one of these blind spots that science has is this, is the relationship to society, right? Like I heard George Church in an interview talking like, at the end of this, or, the pandemic, I think all the biotechers are going to pat themselves on the back and say, look, we get vaccines, antivirals, all this stuff. But if you look at the countries that did the best in terms of containing the virus, it was the ones that had where people wore masks and washed hands and adhered to social distancing guidelines. So it was like a scientifically literate society was actually the more valuable thing than the science itself, right? Like than some of the advanced big science stuff. And of course we want both, but I think scientists in a lot of ways have kind of lost touch with, like they even use language like, we need to figure out a way to talk to the public, or it's like us and them, it's this priesthood. And amateur science and citizen science was this interesting kind of API where it brought in a lot of kind of enthusiasts who became wonderful translators. They communicated not just, and you even in your tweet storm, you're talking about the citizen scientists, the COVID citizen scientists. They communicate not just the results of science, which is a horrible thing to communicate. They communicated the process of science, which is exactly the way it should be communicated. Yeah. So that's one thing. And maybe you can respond to that, and then I can come back to the tool building amateurs.
Let's tackle that one first. So okay. I think, frankly, the jury isn't in on COVID, because now we're seeing that the countries that did well with masking are now stumbling badly with vaccines. And now you can say, yeah, the United States lost 500,000 people, but much of the sort of pioneering vaccine stuff happened here, and we've done, despite our sort of high rates of vaccine denialism or whatever, it's still a country that's like gone really far ahead on vaccines. And part of it is it's a rich country, but part of it is I'm on a lot of WhatsApp groups with my family in India, and the level of like superstitious crap going on there is like astounding. And I would also be wary of prematurely assigning the good outcomes in like Taiwan and some of the East Asian countries, even New Zealand actually, to better science literacy. I don't think that's the actual reason. There's two reasons going on there. And history will be the judge 10 years from now, but I suspect in 10 years when the definitive book is written, they'll conclude that one is all of Asia, like Southeast and East Asia, benefited very strongly from SARS and MERS. Like they were basically socially inoculated against COVID by the experience with SARS, which is still in living memory, and MERS in Korea especially, that was 2009. So they actually got scared out of their wits, one. And the second is, I think they're actually much less scientifically literate or like with a scientific sensibility than the West, but they're much more, and as an Asian, I feel comfortable saying this without coming across as like racist or whatever, but I do think Asians are a lot more conformist. If the authority figures tell them mask up, they'll mask up. And the American tendency to question and challenge authority, it has its good and bad sides. But when Americans, we can talk more about that, but I don't think, though I think the outcome of high rates of masking were a good thing, I don't think the way East Asian societies often get there with the same kinds of like, coercive governance that leads to like, Xinjiang, the Uyghur Muslim population being under effectively police state / genocide, slow genocide going on. The two are part of the same deal. Like the rest of China masks up and obeys orders and stays at home because the government tells them to. And the same government is the one that's responsible for everything we find atrocious. So you got to balance those two against each other. But okay, to your point of how does the West work, the dark side, of course, is the tendency to question authority and stuff like that is what leads to anti-masking, weird conspiracy theories. So the crackpottery that can lead to revolutionary science and like advances in rocketry, like Jack Parsons. So remember, Jack Parsons is also a weird cultist and stuff. It also leads to QAnon. It leads to weird unscientific beliefs. It leads to weird tests of authority that lead to millions of deaths or whatever. So it leads to all that as well. So both sides, the Chinese way and the American way, if I might oversimplify, have their dark side and their light side. In the American side, the light side is that you can do revolutionary daring science. The dark side is you get all this sort of crappy social dynamics and 500,000 people dead. On the Chinese side, the bright side is people conform better to like reasonable, rational policies. But on the other hand, you get a police state and other things. So not much to, it's like hard to choose between those two things. But your point about like science popularizes communicating the output of science versus process, I agree with you that communicating the output creates like weird celebrity fetish stuff around prominent scientists. But even the process stuff is not without its flaws. Like one of the reasons crackpottery exists is crackpots take the idea of quote unquote the scientific method a little too seriously. And there was actually recent research that QAnon people who are skeptical of like, this vaccine research a lot of them are actually a lot more scientific than the blindly conformist people who wear masks. So the people who wear masks on the left, they often come across as like Chinese citizen conformists. Whereas people on the right who challenge masking, they actually end up trying to do bad replication studies of masking and viral transmission. So it's like between a rock and a hard place. These people want like a socialist dystopia where they unquestioningly do whatever the hell Fauci tells them to do. And these people have no fucking clue how to do statistics and think they know. And then they do these things and then say, aha, Fauci did this mistake or covered it up. So both are terrible in my opinion. But I do think there was this, less wrong discussion on pseudoscience being the control group for science. So this is actually a historical thing where pseudoscience people actually stick to what scientists claim is the scientific method a lot more diligently, a lot more cluelessly, but also a lot more diligently. And it's like, if you can't actually tell apart the pseudoscience people who are like claiming parapsychology and telekinesis or UFO stuff from the people who are like, claiming that they are the quote unquote real scientists, and you cannot look at their procedures and tell them apart, that's a problem. And you should actually understand your process at a more philosophically deep level. So you can tell that's crack pottery and this is real science because X, Y, and Z, even though they look alike and they're both methodologically kind of like similar. So you kind of have to have that, I would say, what David Chapman calls, meta rationality or a meta way of understanding, like the, how do I put it? The spirit and soul of the scientific method as opposed to the letter and, rule book of the process, which is what the crackpot crowd often goes after. I don't know if I wandered, but did that answer your question? Yeah.
No, it did, and it was fair pushback on the kind of the simple story of like what the East versus West and kind of vaccines and societal response. I think my interest still remains like what we're talking about is I think it's like a real crisis of science communication, and I think science communication is emerging from this multi-decade long reaction to Carl Sagan, where it was like nobody, ostracizing anyone who tried to become popular and like overdoing it a little bit and saying, no, we should talk about it, and realizing that there's an emerging science of science communication where people are studying the things that you're talking about, where actually just informing people more, like giving them more data, doesn't actually change minds, and it doesn't, all the stuff you're talking about in terms of the anti-maskers, actually adhering to the scientific method. Turns out we don't understand. We haven't really been thinking critically about how best to, communicate science in the 1990s, let alone like the 2020s.
I think I have a problem with even the idea of communication, because it assumes a boundary between people on the one side, quote unquote, doing science, and people on the other side almost serving as like an audience of science. It's like, the politician versus voter divide, or the entrepreneur versus consumer divide. And I think it's especially toxic in science, because I should sort of give context of where I'm coming from. One of the last conversations I had with my PhD advisor, so this was a decade after I'd finished and a couple of years before he passed away. So this was around 2013. We were talking about these problems with science and stuff. And I was talking about what I now think of as a naive idea of like, there should be more interdisciplinary science. And that's why I didn't stay in academia, because there's no way to do the mix of control theory, AI, and operations research that I wanted to without falling through the cracks. So that was kind of like my naive thing. And my professor, who was very interdisciplinary in his own way, sort of pushed back with an even more radical idea. He was like, I think we should do away with disciplinary majors altogether. There's just engineering, and engineering should be thought of as a liberal art. And that really stuck with me. It's like, why do we have these disciplinary boundaries? It's primarily because funding agencies who don't understand what's going on need like a very legible map with which to operate. It's like, all right, we have $1 billion in budget and for engineering, so we're going to give 300 million to aerospace, 200 million to computer science. It's a bureaucratic artifact, the disciplinary structure of science. And now that I'm trying to get back into research mode in a very different way, one of the first things I find I enjoy a lot about the way I'm doing research now is completely ignoring not just boundaries between disciplines, but every other sort of boundary between professional and amateur, between theoretical and experimental, between practical and impractical, between like serious and playful research, between things I'm doing with buddies who are better at soldering than me, but may not have degrees, and with academic friends who have stayed in academia. So it's like throw away all the boundaries and get back to kind of like an early modern, 17th century, the way Galileo and people in his era used to think of science, which is quote unquote natural science. Like a lot of the early scientists were, for example, instrument makers. Today, it's like, yeah, astronomers don't build their own Hubbles, right? They do their serious research on like professionally built instruments. Some of them might do amateur shit on the side, but instrument making is not part of science. Whereas Newton, who is considered today one of the primary theoretical pioneers of physics, people forget that he was also not just an experimentalist, but also a tool maker. He played around with prisms, and he poked around with random crap. There's jokes about him cutting a door for his cat in his like door. So those boundaries were not there. And in my own way, one of the things I'm trying to do is, and we can get into this when we talk about what I'm working on now, I'm trying to like look at the phenomenology of what's worth researching without all the social and institutional boundaries we impose on it. And it's giving me a whole new perspective of how to think about, engineering, science, technology, everything.
So I'm with you 100%. And the reason I was kind of going down that science communication thread is I think it is a crisis. Like I think they're going to like keep trying to find a better way to do this. But I've come to my current perspective is much closer to yours, where it's like we actually have a lot to learn from the birders and the amateur astronomers in the way that they've kind of blurred the lines. I think there's more to learn there about where what the future could be versus like actually just trying to like have a discipline of science communication that does this professionally. I think maybe that's okay, but we'll see. I think the amateurs are the amateur orientation is like, to me, there's something actually happening there that's worth paying attention to. But the second thing about that is, and the last thing, which I think is actually the most compelling and the most understudied, is the thing that you just brought up, and it kind of leads into your work now, which is this idea of instrumentation. And in particular, amateurs, like the history of amateurs having a role in instrument building, and these kind of amateur scenes starting to build things. I sent you, I think before, that Michael Schrage article about kits and revolutions,
yes.
Which to me is like it was like this jewel of a piece that no one, it kind of went under the radar, and it was on the Make blog. And I think that should be a whole like
I should thank you for that. I sent it on to a couple of my clients in the chemistry industry. We've been talking since then about like, can we actually do kits for high-end industrial chemistry, and can we create a maker revolution in chemistry? Because chemistry is far harder than electronics, because you're working with like enormous pressures and like toxic ingredients. But it was like a very fertile line of thought. And I think that's actually it. But to build on something you said earlier, even the distinction between like thinking in terms of amateur birders or astronomers, that's a late Victorian way of thinking. Like around 1860s or something, this whole bourgeois community emerged in like very prosperous late Victorian England, which had a lot of wealth, colonial wealth or whatever. So a huge burgeoning middle class with time to pursue hobbies. And that's the origin story of 90% of the hobbies today. Everything from stamp collecting to steam engines to birding to microscopy, all of that came then. But I want to take that back to an even earlier era. So early 19th century, so about 30 years after James Watt's patents on the steam engine expired. So 1770 to around 1800, James Watt was kind of like an asshole entrepreneur type who controlled the steam engine industry. But when his patents expired, it sparked this huge blue-collar revolution in Cornwall, where I have a thread about this. I call it the blue-collar mutual influence network, where you had this Cornish mining district. There's a paper about this, where a whole bunch of tinkerers had their own labs where they were like tweaking steam engines. and thousands of teeny little improvements were made with the steam engine. So James Watt is rightly famous for, inventing the governor and like improving the steam engine and so forth. But these thousands of anonymous tinkerers who took like the primitive crappy steam engine and like evolved it to like 100x capability, early 20, 30 years of the 19th century. So this was lower blue collar tinkering class, not the wealthy noble class. So I think all three classes have things to do. Like you've got the nobility that's rich enough to like have mansions and their own lab. So all the famous early chemists were like that. For example, Lord Cavendish, people like that, they have a role to play. You've got the bourgeois middle class with its amateur instincts. That's got a role to play. And then the blue collar crowd with its like years of tinkering and improving everything from like scientific instrumentation to pioneering technologies. All three classes have a big role to play. And I think rather than communication, that's what's worth doing, which is, can you like basically get everybody involved in a widespread scientific culture? That's true scientific literacy, not what we see in China, where like, test prep means all the kids do better in math than American kids, but they're not actually innovative in math. So you want this kind of like tinkering approach to everything across society. That's, I think, far superior to communication as the goal.
I agree. And that, to me, I wrote a whole book about the maker movement as being like this, like, to me, this was this magical time and this great group of people and technologies that kind of came together and ideas. And it's interesting to me why that it kind of burned out. And I have some theories on why that happened. I think like idealism is like only a mediocre fuel. I don't know that you can sustain kind of movements on idealism for very long. And I think they maybe over relied on that. So that's one. So, okay. So, but the tool building, I think, is a really rich vein, because most people are, and especially scientists are really science. Are you familiar with the work of Peter Gallison?
No.
Okay, he's written a bunch of books like How Experiments End and Image and Logic, and he's a science and technology historian. He directed that film, The Edge of All We Know.
Okay.
So he's got these big, thick books where he embeds himself with physicists and kind of studies scientists and how they work. And he's got it's a much more illegible theory than Thomas Kuhn's like theory of paradigms, which is really kind of like, people think that's true, but it's not.
That book has done so much damage.
So much damage.
Yeah,
and so, but Gallison has this, I think, a much better way of phrasing this. And I'm always like skeptical of simple, simple theories of innovation. I think they're a dime a dozen, and they're, some of them are useful, I guess, because they're simple, but his talks about theory and experiments and instrumentation being like this track, like we need all three of them, and they all push sciences forward. And I think the one that I think gets the least amount of attention is the instrumentation. And the instrumentation gets a lot of attention on the bigger scales, right? Like I was on NOAA's advisory board for ocean exploration, and the only thing that kind of comes up in discussion is how many ships can we have and have this big telepresence system, like these massively coordinated
Hubble scale things,
big science. Whereas really important things can happen when small scale projects get going. And I don't know if this is the right analogy, but I think, like Schrage talks about the Homebrew Computer Club, right? And they created a cultural, they made computing different, right? Like they created this kind of interface that everyone has now had to contend with. And so I think that's the interesting thing that amateur revolutions can do. And I think we saw the first kind of instantiation of this with biology, like the first like DIY bio wave, like 10 years ago, has kind of come and gone. And I think we're due for another wave. Like I think the amateur, I think we're still waiting for the kind of Steve Jobs of biology and the big amateur movement, and the whole interface of how we interact with biotechnology, I think is still up for grabs.
And I think perhaps you're a little jaded and cynical from being part of the first wave of the maker movement. I think it totally succeeded. Like there's this time, like these things have like cyclical historical patterns. And there is, in fact, a time for the idealists to do their thing. They come in starry-eyed, paint visions, projects get started excitedly, 9 out of 10 of them fail. But that phase has its role in a social movement. And I think our mutual friend, I think Nick was who introduced us, right? Nick Pinkston.
Correct. Yeah.
And when I started tweeting about maker shit like 6 to 8 months ago, Nick was laughing at me. It's like, hey, you're 10 years late to the party. And I was like, no, this is actually the right time for the second wave, because as somebody who came from academia with a much more theoretical simulation-oriented background, the shit in 2006 was like terrible. It wasn't something I could actually use. Like the early Atmel boards, the early 3D printers, way too janky for me. But now things have improved to the point where even like two left hands or whatever kind of person like me with very poor maker skills can actually do things, and things have improved to the point. So I think we're now at the Act 2, where it will be the less idealistic, more pragmatic people, but also more importantly, a much bigger circle of people with less hands-on skill who can now get on with the show because things are much easier. Oh, and I wanted to make sure I mention this book. I've just started reading it. Adam Elkus on Twitter, he's a good friend, recommended it to me. Thing Knowledge, A Philosophy of Scientific Instruments.
Okay.
It's by Davis Baird. So I started reading it. It's already very promising. And there's a couple of other books I started reading in this vein. So I think this is like, it's a philosophy whose time has come. And that's one reason to the other sort of prep question you sent me about like my research mode. You said you wanted me to share my screen, and I was like, I can share my screen and there's stuff to show there, but 70% of what I'm doing now is very consciously trying to get away from the screen and doing much more embodied and situated thinking, where I'm trying to like, do my own instrument making, thinking with my hands, and like I said, I don't believe in the distinctions between experimental and theoretical, or practical and impractical, or play versus serious. I kind of want it all to become one big soup. So I wouldn't call myself an experimentalist, not least because I suck at it. I'm really bad at everything from soldering to like programming Arduino code. But the fact is, just doing it and making that the context of how I'm thinking about even like, theoretical problems or philosophical problems is very, very sort of valuable. And it's like totally changed how I think about this stuff. So I might be the sort of like, even though I imagine I'm like maybe a decade older than you, I feel like a kid now, and you're the jaded, seasoned professional.
I was going to say that earlier because it's interesting, because I've been the path that you're starting down, and I've heard you talk about the kind of Act 2, and the path I see you starting down is so interesting because it reminds me so much of what I was doing 10 years ago. Meanwhile, I'm on the kind of the other side, like trying to like gather my thoughts on all this amateurism and like just trying to put my thoughts together and share in a coherent way. So I'm kind of going down the path that you've been on for 10 years, like trying to actually communicate some of these ideas and not in like a, maybe a book or whatever, but I'm more interested in following in your footsteps and creating a way of sharing ideas with a community of engaged people, and like experimenting with mediums and formats, and like not trying to be a bestseller, but trying to, like just trying to enjoy the whole process.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the best way, because in a way you could say that we're both following each other's footsteps. Like I'm starting something with the Yak Rover project that's like 10 years in your footsteps with the Open ROV project. And in the other mode, like you seem to be exploring philosophical questions about institutional science that I left behind 10 years ago when I left academia. So we're following each other. It could be a circle and we're in the desert. Both of us are lost. It could be that's a positive feedback virtuous cycle where we'll both learn from like trying to like learn from each other's paths. Or it could be that both of us are like have our heads up our asses and we'll both like, negative vicious cycle of like becoming stupider and stupider. But I'm sort of optimistic that it's the first of the three, which is, virtuous cycle of like, learning from different paths. But yeah.
So I'm not, I'll tell you what, I'm not jaded. I got burnt out and I had to take like some time off. but since like the past year, like I've become really proud of the work we've done. And like, and like there, some things didn't work out. Like we were talking about, Chinese knockoffs, like coming in and flooding the market. And, the company aspects where I learned a lot there, but I think like there's some real like nuggets of wisdom. And I do want to make sure that I get that out, especially to folks like you, who I think are headed in precisely the right direction. And anyways, just so that people can learn from what we did. So maybe like for the next steps, you can show, because we were talking about the workshop and
totally.
the, maybe let's do that, but starting with a quick overview of the Yak Rover project and kind of how
let's do that. So you want me to share my screen, right?
Yep.
Let's see, let me pull this up. Okay, let me share my tab first. Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are you seeing my desktop or my browser?
Desktop.
Okay, can you see my browser now?
Yep.
Okay, let's see. Yak Rover. So this is our Rome research page, and let me actually start with the more public-facing thing. So if you go to yakcollective.org / this Yak Rover, this is basically it. So right now it's basically a build party. So for the first year, we are taking this philosophy of like, forget the boundaries and do everything with your hands. Don't write theories or white papers. Just try to actually build rovers. That's the idea. And for the pilot here, 5 of us are building rovers. So I'm building something that looks very much like the Mars rover, a 6-wheel rocker bogie. I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. A couple of other people, let me mention their names. So Meyer Fenster is in Israel and Eric Platon is in Japan. And both of them are working with this one. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the top right, that's a Hexapod robot. So they're interested in legged rovers. So it's a Hexapod from a Japanese company that they're like hacking and programming to act as a rover. So the packaged one is the one right below. Then Anuraj is a telecom engineer working out of Finland for Nokia, and he's building a model of the ESA rover. So the ESA is sending a Mars rover, and they have like an open source kit, and he's basically building that. So 3D printing the body and building it. So he's focused on like the embedded electronics with RISC-V boards as sort of the next phase of embedded controls. So his research focus is doing that. Meyer and Eric are trying to do like more social stuff. So they're not focused on the hardware stuff. They're trying to like explore how rovers can collaborate and communicate while exploring a terrain. That's why they're working with 2 identical rovers. I'm trying to do a full stack build. So I'm designing and printing and everything from scratch as much as possible. Not the boards, of course, but as much from scratch as possible. And a couple of other projects members who joined recently, Victor and Rhett, whose name is not yet listed, they're building small kit cars and focusing on like the higher level software stacks, like internet connected rovers and things like that. And I should also mention Joshua Wilcox. He's like an experienced robotics guy who like consults for robotics companies. He's kind of become our informal consultant, teaching us about batteries and motors and things like that. So there's a Yak Rover project. Anybody who's interested can sign up for our, just go to Yak Collective, sign up. You'll get access to our Discord. And can you see my Discord screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is our Discord channel. It's us discussing various rover stuff. We have every Monday night, 9:45 p.m. Pacific group meeting. That's the only time that works for us, where we take turns talking about the status of our builds, how we are progressing, what research questions we are exploring, and basically peer learning. So we brainstorm each other's questions. Some of us know about some things more than others, so we help each other out. And I think our overall focus to connect to your Open ROV project, I think one of the things we learned is, yes, if you try to like plug into Silicon Valley and entrepreneurship and try to build companies out of it, you will face the problems of, it's going to get cheap knockoffs are going to come, the price curves are going to kill you. It's happening to Boston Dynamics, right? Their $60,000 dog. Now there's like 12K dogs that are knockoffs, and I even saw a 3K one, right? So my own instinct is, the true north is not Silicon Valley. The true north is NASA. So if you're focusing on, can you actually get open source literal rovers? Like if Elon Musk does what he promises and gets like 10 $10 to low Earth orbit in 10 years with like the Starship launches, you can actually potentially see actual open source rovers on Mars, I think under 100K in total cost. So about the cost of a CubeSat now. So you can actually hope to do research grade stuff. So pie in the sky dreams, but this is not, at least my personal interest. Everybody has their different interests in coming to the Yak Rover project, but my interest is much more on, can we actually get to open source rovers on NASA? And yes, if we get like people doing spin-off startups, I'm fine. If people end up like, if we do some really clever design and some Chinese company makes like a very cheap version of that, I'm fine. So those things are not interesting to me because Silicon Valley is not my true north on this thing. It is literally like, rovers in the scientific sense that NASA pursues them. So that's our
Can I make a comment? Like, this is just based on what I learned. I hate to break your flow, but I really want to tell you this because I've spent so much time doing something similar. What was interesting for us with OpenROV was this idea of telerobotics, which you're exploring in a different, via medium, is really understudied, right? Like people just really, like a lot of roboticists want to jump to automation. And I think this idea of telerobotics is really underappreciated and often overlooked, this idea of embodying robots in distant places and dangerous places. And there was really good research happening about this. There still is. I also think like the technology is really, really good. And the thing that's driving that has mostly been the autonomous car space. There's been a lot, because they need to remotely pilot a lot of these things. So the tech for teleoperation has advanced a lot. And I think one of the things I'm so excited about your project is, and the thing that we were just starting to get into with OpenROV was the interface for telerobotics, right? Like we know, like the NOAA's ships, like they're going to be on these ships and the scientists are going to collaborate. But I think when we're talking about this democratization of this, I don't think the infrastructure is set yet. Like we would give these controls to kids to control robots around the world. So like we'd, be in Oakland and they would be flying robots in Hawaii and you couldn't pull the kids off them. So like you just knew that there was something interesting there. But it was also fun to do this in a group, like have a TV set up and have like a small group of people. So I think this idea of the interface for telerobotics, like democratized telerobotics, is really underexplored. And so I think I'm more excited about your groups exploring this because you may find something interesting in a way that I don't think NOAA and NASA really has time to kind of think about or figure out. So anyways, that was the kind of
That's actually a great cue because it's where our head is at collectively right now. So I just pulled up this presentation. This was just last night. So Meyer, who's one of our team members in Israel, you definitely should actually have him on your show and have him talk about this stuff. He did this talk for us. He's focusing most on this, and his stack. So I'm just using his slides. By the way, this is like working in public. We all share each other's materials. He's literally built a stack. And if you go to the Yak Collective, one of our accounts is the Yak Rover Twitter account, Yak_Rover, I think. And it's basically completely, this is the stack. This rover, his rover tweets on Twitter and it streams its live video using Twilio. He did a session for us a few weeks back when we were actually on Discord commanding his rover in Israel to like move around his garden and look at things. So literally we are using like a completely open consumer web set of technologies to do social things. And the plan is all the rovers we are building, if hopefully they manage to get this infrastructure up right. So this can run on any Linux board. So, Raspberry Pi or Beagle board, which I'm using, it can run on any such board. It's a little stack that basically makes it a teleoperations robot. And hopefully by this time next year, if we talk again, we should have multiple robots talking to each other and to the world via Discord, via Twitter, and wandering around different parts of the world. So you're right. It's totally exciting. It's not something that could have been done in, I don't know, even as recently as 5 years back, because all these technologies were very weak. Yeah,
you're right. And I also think like the connectivity stuff from Starlink, like all of a sudden, this is a very real possibility. And it's like it was interesting because we got to right there, and then we had all these business constraints that didn't allow us to like playfully explore the space. So that's why I'm so enthusiastic about this, because I think that you guys
I
can.
hope your enthusiasm is justified. And we have been approaching this in a very conscious way. It's not like we're trying to reinvent the wheel or relearn the hard way the lessons you guys in the wave one of the maker movement already did. We studied that stuff carefully. Like all of us are very aware of it. We had peripheral participation. Like all of us are actually older. So Meyer, Eric, and I are like in our 40s and 50s. A couple of the younger ones are in the 30s. But there's nobody in their 20s, for example. So these are all experienced people who were around working in industry, doing their own thing 10 years ago. So
Yeah.
we tend older as a group, but we would love to have like people of all ages joining us. But yeah, I'm actually excited to show you more on this stuff. But just to wrap up on this stuff, yeah, so this is we do a lot of our open notebook-based research collections on Roam. So Roam, I think, is a great tool for open research. We have meetings. Let's see, year one meetings. So weekly meetings. We have notes. We kind of like collectively take notes. Let's see if I can find a good one to. Oh, never mind. So this is the collective side of how we are doing the Rover project. And on the, I didn't get a chance to talk too much about my own side, but let's see. I also have my own personal Roam, and yeah, this is, for example, this is my Roam kit. Let me go back here. Oh, I call it, by the way, the Toaster Lab, because this is my personal maker lab or workshop. I call it the Toaster Lab after the Hitchhiker's Guide, where Arthur Dent suddenly realizes, even though he considers himself modern, he has no idea how anything is made. So he thinks, all right, I have no clue how a toaster works or how to make a toaster. So that became like a running joke. And there was this interesting art project by a British artist hacker named, I think Thomas Thwaites was his name, who literally tried to build a toaster. I don't know if you've seen the video. And
it's one of my favorite books. Yeah, it's like it's just one of the best projects.
So I want to do what he did, but not in sort of an artsy, make a like almost a joke of it kind of thing, but more realistically and pragmatically, which is all right. Literally, can I explore the stack, the modern technological stack, in the sense Herbert Simon talked about, like, the sciences of the artificial. And can I actually reasonably attempt to become a full stack engineer? Maybe not a 10x or like genius engineer, but how far can I get understanding every layer of the stack and not do this like art project like Toaster that looked like a melted pile of crap, but in this case, like try and build a rover inspired by the highest tech thing we've ever managed to do, which is like, send a rover to Mars and see how much I can get in understanding our whole tech stack, trying to build something like it. So not like a joke, but as far as I can get, build and buy what I can, borrow what I cannot build myself. So that's kind of the inspiration. So I have my set of programs. I do like, astronomy, 3D printing and so forth. And my main big project is the rover. So that's my notebook side.
So cool. Yeah, that's like so I wrote a book called Zero to Maker, which was me trying to learn how to make like I tried to do this, and it's interesting because I got so derailed in terms of project administration.
I'm still closer to zero than maker, but it's a very fun zero to be.
I think that me too. I'm still zero.
Let me stop sharing, and instead I wanted to show off my lab. Basically, I'm kind of proud of what I've built in just 6 months. So it's kind of fun just buying a lot of shit, honestly. I'm going to change microphones, and then this camera is on a long USB, so I can show you guys.
Cool.
All right, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Say something. I can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Good.
Okay, cool.
So I'm going to unclip this camera.
By the way, my goal for this next quarter is to start doing lab tours. So I'm going to have a whole other section of the site that's like, I'm going to go and visit labs and interview people and walk through their physical spaces where they do research, which I think should be really fun.
So this can be a beta test of lab tour. So I'm trying to give you a lab tour here.
Yeah.
One of my big things, I do a lot of my work on my computer, of course, Python programming, Rome for like notes and stuff, but I do use notebooks as well. So I've really gotten back into using physical notebooks as my sort of primary sort of offline thinking tool. I still use an iPad and a pencil, but physical notebooks are turning really good. So I start a notebook for every project I have and every client I have. I also am really getting back into whiteboard use. So in preparing for this call, you sent me those questions. So I scribbled out my like talking points on a whiteboard, and I find it very sort of, I don't know, restful to think in whiteboard ways. Let me see. This is my actual workshop. So like I said, I have a lot of inspiration from the original scientific revolution, and a lot of it was driven by three fields: clockmaking, astronomy, and microscopy. So all three are on my radar. So the first maker project I did was actually the skit clock. It's a literal pendulum clock. So I was like, all right, scientific revolution started with Galileo, and then Huygens actually inventing the pendulum clock. So I'm going to make a pendulum clock. So this is my first maker build. I've been an amateur astronomer for a long time, and I was reading about this stuff last year, and one of my friends, actually the dad of an artist I work with, he said he had an unused telescope lying around, so he just sent it to me. So this is the first telescope I've had since high school when I had a similar size telescope. So I was doing a lot of photography of Jupiter and Saturn during the conjunction last year, getting into astrophotography, and that was a lot of fun. And this is my newest toy. I just got a compound lab microscope. So I'm really excited about it.
That's awesome.
All right. And this is my main work.
This is really exciting and actually inspiring. This is what I'm hoping to set up here.
I'm personally inspired. Like I spent like maybe, I'd say a couple of $1,000s on this. So this is a luxury. Like, you have to have a certain amount of like disposable income to play at this level. Like most high school kids can't, so they can't drop like, I would say my lab is probably 3,000-4,000 in like goodies right now. Let's see. Usual tour. Some of this is.
So tell me more about the microscopy stuff, because I think that what kind of projects are you hoping to use that?
This was literally Amazon Prime Day had a sale on microscopes. It's been on my wish list for a while. And but to connect it to our earlier talking, like a lot of instrument builders were interested in everything optics. Like I just took a tour of the Mount Wilson observatory that's near LA. It was until 1949, that was the biggest telescope, 100-inch telescope. And the builder of that, a guy named Hale, he built the 60-inch telescope, the 100-inch, and then the 200-inch at Mount Palomar. And there was an archive. I'll send you the photograph later, but there was an archive of his documents. And one of them was like a bunch of pencil sketches of microbes. And I realized he was into microscopy as well. So this builder of like really big famous telescopes in his spare time was also doing microscopy. So that's an interesting thing to remember about instrument building as integral to science. Like this builder of big telescopes was also doing microscopes, even though he was primarily an astronomer. All right, so more tools. 3D printer. So from your generation's innovations and maker movements, that's my Arduino Mega board right now. I'm just sort of calibrating this ultrasonic sensor, which I'm hoping to put on my Rover. A couple more things about the Rover. Okay, so as far as real things with my Rover project go, this is the most real thing that exists right now. This is what's known as the differential bar. Something like this is on Perseverance and Curiosity. It's because it's a 6-wheeled vehicle without an active spring-based suspension, because springs don't work on Mars because of the temperature, the lubricants freeze up and shit like that. So they use a completely kinematic suspension. And what that does is, I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but if I move one side, the bar pushes the other side down. And these are the hinges on which the 3 wheels on each side are connected. So what effectively happens is, if one side of the rover, the front wheel, climbs up a rock, it pushes down on the corresponding wheel on the other side to increase traction. So just like when you're walking, if you're like unstable on one foot, the other foot like increases traction. We do that automatically with walking locomotion. With rovers, this is important. This is basically the hip joint of a 6-wheeled rover. So this is the mechanical side of my research going on. This is a test chassis I'm building for the motor control. So there you can see like a little servo control that's going to be the steering motor. That's the little drive motor I'm going to use. That's from Adafruit. It came with a quadrature sensor attached. So to your point, like 10 years ago, all this was like a million times harder. You didn't have Adafruit. You didn't have like a million cheap components. You didn't have like a third generation Arduino boards. You didn't have Raspberry Pis. Oh, this board is amazing. This is the BeagleBone. So the BeagleBone is 20. The BeagleBone was 2013, but the BeagleBone Blue is a robotic-specific single-board Linux computer. That's basically the BeagleBone Black with an integrated robotics hat. It can drive 4 motors, 8 servos, 4 quadrature sensors, can drive about 4.5 amps. But the reason I'm pointing this out is this truly is like next generation maker boards. It's like light years beyond the original Arduino or even the RPi, because if I were to try and replicate this with an RPi or an Arduino, it would be like 2 or 3 different hats would have the functionality. I would have like, a bunch of breakout boards. I would need 10x the maker skill to actually do anything with it. This has simplified it down. Like this has made robotics within my skill level as primarily a theory guy. Let's see. Other stuff, microscope. I collect a lot of junk. So those are some cardboard tubes I collected. Like last time I moved, these are like saran wrap type things. And there are these really solidly built tubes. So I thought these are like really too nice to not use for something else. So I just scavenged them. And one of my projects is to build my own telescope. That makes a great telescope tube. So I ordered like a 4-inch.
That's funny you say that. I've got all my Dobsonian books out. Oh, they're in the other room right now. But I was going to build a telescope. That's going to be one of my projects too. Anyways,
yeah,
I'm thinking along the same lines.
So yeah, the point of that is that it's partly joke, partly my wife says I have a hoarding problem with boxes and like random shit, but partly it goes to what I think of as stack research, toaster lab idea. The idea is that the modern technological stack is so complex that one of the best ways to study is actually like look at all the junk and packaging and weird shit, and that gives you, it's like doing an MRI on the stack. Like you've got stuff coming from Alibaba in China, you've got stuff that's packaging from boxes you get from Amazon. One of my favorite things to think about is, I'm sure you have a box like this as well. Like just a box of old random ass cables, like ancient connected cables, phone cables. I literally have like RS-232 cables from the telephone era, like landline era. And this is like, back here, like it's 10 years worth of, not 10, it's more like 25 years worth of random cables collecting. Yes, I have a hoarding problem a little bit, but I think especially guys, a lot of guys have this, but there's also a serious idea behind there, which is, like when I got the telescope, it didn't come with like a power adapter, and I just looked through my pile and I found one from like some discarded cell phone or something 10 years old, and I didn't have to buy a new one. And I think there's an important point there. We're going to have to, as the technological stack gets more complex, global supply chains get more complex, and software gets older, devices get older, lots of these sort of random, accessories get littered around. Not only do you have like a big sort of environmental problem, and with like, climate change, you want to like reduce material use and stuff, you're also kind of losing situation awareness of what technology actually is. And I think an archaeological component to technology is like really increasingly important now. Like if you can scavenge something for 15, 20 years ago and reuse it in something new, it tells you something about how this technological stack is aging, right? Like just yesterday, I was tweeting about trying to salvage a netbook that's 2014 vintage running a 2013 processor. I was trying to install Windows 10 on it. It didn't work. I'm now installing Linux on it. I think we all need to do a lot more of that kind of like scavenging oriented exploration of the stack. And it's now a legit subject in technology side of engineering research.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm familiar with that. I'm doing research on waste right now.
Yeah,
so, So, there's one thing that like comes up on this, because there's also the progress studies crowd right now is very interested in independent research and new sorts of research labs and things like that. And it's kind of a buzzy term. And someone kind of, I forgot who said this on Twitter, but they were kind of bringing up this idea that it has to be like, if only I had, and I can't even, I've been working on experiment.com now for a while, and I can't even tell you how many people say, oh, if only I had $1 billion, then I would invest in scientific research. And like, there's this vision that the only way to participate in science is to like make a lot of money and then, develop your own lab. And I think that's like true. And you talk about kind of John Carmack or, different people who've kind of got rich and then built their lab. But I also think there's a different kind of model to the research lab, which looks to me, are you familiar with Ed Ricketts, Doc Ricketts?
No.
Who?
No. Oh, okay. Doc Ricketts now sounds familiar. Yeah.
Okay, so he was the inspiration for John Steinbeck's Cannery Row, Doc, the character. And he was a marine biologist who lived and worked in Monterey Bay, right on Cannery Row. He had his lab there called Pacific Biological Laboratory, where in the front, he was selling specimens. He would go down to the tide pools and like collect specimens, and he would sell them to, different people for, scientific purposes. And he was running this kind of small operation in the front, selling kit. And then, also doing really important, in the back, he was doing really important research. And I love this idea of these kind of small lifestyle businesses. I know you kind of had a thread earlier on lifestyle businesses versus what do you call them? What was the word for like that change the producer and the consumer? You called it type of business. Anyways, I'll put a link to it. It doesn't matter.
Way too much.
No, I love that. But anyways, it's an interesting idea because that was also an intellectual home for John Steinbeck and for what's the hero with 1,000 faces, Joseph Campbell. Mm-hmm. They were there in that scene, and they would have these kind of, like that was the group that they grew up with, sharing ideas. And so there was this amazing intellectual output, and that kind of created, that was a really defining force in this kind of California ideology, and inspired a lot of folks.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that scale, people underestimate how accessible it is. Like,
I agree.
I said, like, my lab, yes, I'm not a starving artist or a student. I make good money as a consultant, but this whole thing didn't take me more than like a few $1,000s to put together. So definitely not millions or billions that, wealthy billionaire scientists have. So you can have a lot of fun with a kind of lifestyle lab. Let's call it a lifestyle lab with fairly modest resources, not zero resources, but not billions either.
Yeah. So can you, well, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I agree with you that it's very accessible, and it kind of has been. The barrier to entry really is people's kind of curiosity and willingness to be a beginner and to kind of, I don't want to say look stupid, but like that, I wrote a whole book about like admitting what I didn't know. And I think like that's a powerful idea in today's world, is like just being like, if you're willing to be an amateur and to say, I don't know how that works, but I want to learn. It's a really wonderful, wonderful time. It's a real golden age for that. And I think the thing that I was reading on the Yak Collective was the new Future Frontiers the projects that you've put together. And this is actually, I think, one of the more romantic things you've ever done. Like it feels like you're intellectually, not just intellectually, but your identity is invested in you've put skin in the game, and you say, this is a potential way to make meaning in the world. And I was so excited because I've found meaning in my own life and in the world through doing something very similar. And so I want to talk about that. Can you talk about the Future Frontiers, what your hope is for that, and kind of what you see taking shape there?
So for context, for those of you who are not familiar, so the Yak Collective is structured around basically an open P2P non-hierarchical project structure. It's like basically just a Roam database and a Discord. Groups come together, people propose projects. If other people want to sign up, they sign up and do it. So we've done maybe 4 or 5 projects so far. And Future Frontiers was one. We started off last year with a different idea in mind, like doing like a fairly broad and intense survey of like different frontiers that might emerge in the future. But then it sort of morphed into, let's just make that our web page for occasionally adding like little bits and snippets of like glimpses of frontiers. So when we first launched the project, so these projects usually are like time bound, so we try to finish them in a few months and publish them. This one, we call it like an infinity pool project, as in we put up a little bit of content initially, but then it becomes a placeholder for basically people to add more things. So somebody joins the Yak Collective and says, hey, I have some excitement about some new frontier. Yeah, we'll throw a couple of slides together, maybe a short essay or blurb. We'll throw it on that page along with it. So it's evolving in that mode as almost like an index or directory of things we find exciting. And in a way, it's like more intensive and active projects like the Yak Rover kind of fit under that philosophical umbrella. It's like, all right, Future Frontiers was like a survey of a bunch of frontiers. And then Yak Rover is, all right, let's actually go deep and start trying to build rovers out of this. So the way it's structured right now is, I think the Yak Collective, even though it's a network of independent consultants who are like primarily looking to do better in the gig economy, get consulting projects, there's also sort of a thematic bias. It's people who are like predisposed to like actually doing things and shipping as opposed to like talking and doing thought leadership. It's for people who realize that if you're a consultant, your ability to do hands-on work is limited. Like you're advising other people who are doing hands-on stuff, but your own ability to do things at an ambitious scale is low. So the Yak Collective is a place you can actually nurture your own sort of like keeping your own work going and your own growth going kind of stuff. So the Yak Collective, it's got a bunch of projects that are more businessy and a bunch that are kind of, I would say, more idealistic, like you're talking about. And the Future Frontiers is, I would call it an umbrella for that kind of project. So if, for example, you wanted to do version 2 of the Open ROV project, you could start that as like a Yak.
No way, I'm not doing that again.
But I mean, somebody else might have that idea. But the point is, you can come there, you can sort of explore it under the Future Frontiers project. And if you like it enough, you can sort of spin off a deep dive project and rope in a couple of other people and get going. We have a couple of such projects already started. There's a bunch of people trying to do something with fitness trackers. So I'm wearing one right now. This is the Whoop. It does heart rate measurements and stuff. So a bunch of us were wearing this and tracking our health, so vaguely quantified selfish. And as we talked, we were all sharing our sort of grouses about how this device doesn't work very well. And somebody suggested, hey, this stuff is cheap enough that we should be able to like buy cheap chips and try and make our own. So now there's conversations going on about trying to make our own fitness tracker. Don't know if it'll go anywhere, but that's the general way we like to do things at the Yak Collective. Like, come join, attend a few meetings, should post on the Discord. At some point, if you feel like exploring an idea at the level of just writing about it, throw together a slide deck or some text and put it on the website. If you want to go deeper, pull together a team and start doing more. So that's our kind of rough model here.
So one thing I think, you've kind of talked about is all these other people. And I think that's the amazing thing. I've been in the bar group for a while, and I've been kind of on your radar, I think, like in the periphery of your work. And it's a community I really value. I'm not super active there, but I learn a lot, I gain a lot. And I think you've done a wonderful job kind of curating that. And I'm wondering, maybe, what is it how do you actively describe the process that you have, or the network around you, or how do you think about these communities as like extended parts of your thinking?
So
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So again, for those, like I'm sure your audience is kind of like not quite connected to the world we are talking about right now. But yeah, my sort of past before the sort of maker chapter of my career was, it still is a blogger at Ribbon Farm. And I also write this newsletter, which is the Ribbon Farm Studio that's on Substack. Ribbon Farm is a WordPress blog. And that started in 2007 while I was still at Xerox. And when I went independent in 2011, it kind of became the hub of my consulting work as well. And around that time, I did a bunch of meetups. I was doing a big road trip I was moving from DC to Vegas and then eventually to Seattle. But I did a big road tripping thing and met a lot of my readers. I'd just written my first book, Tempo. So that was the excuse. It was quote unquote a book tour. But I did a bunch of meetups, especially in the Bay Area. And there was enough there that we decided to do what became Refactor Camp. So this was 2012, and that event went on. We had the last one in 2019, so 7 iterations. Wonderful group grew out of that. The Facebook groups you mentioned, Bay Area Refactorings, that's one of the groups that came out of the Refactor Camp event. And it's, I would say that community, plus a lot of people who contribute to Ribbon Farm also are part of that community. So Ribbon Farm was more of a team blog a few years ago than it is now. I'm back to solo mode right now, but it's had like over the years, maybe 30, 40 contributors who've written a lot, including makers of various types. But yeah, that community, I would say the distinctive feature about it is it grew almost entirely by accident, because everybody else who was like growing blog-based communities at the time, sort of contemporary to me, so I would call myself like early generation blogger, 2007. Everybody else kind of wanted to grow a community. So it was part of their roadmap of, I'll grow this community, I'll have this event. For me, it was like, oh shit, I hope I don't have to do this. Oh shit, hope I don't have to do this. But it was like, I did this as like, it was almost the community organization equivalent of a shit post. It's like, hey, let's do a meetup. And it's like, hey, these people at the meetup are fun to talk to. Let's talk more. Oh shit, a conference is probably the best way to talk more to them, you know? Yeah. And it snowballed from that. And I think that ended up being the biggest reason that it was actually successful. The fact that I had no ambitions for it at all. I didn't want to like create a big event or make money from it or like have like a members only community that would pay me big subscription fees. Everything we did with Refactor Camp and what's followed on has been nonprofit, non-loss, or completely free. That's partly because I had no ambitions in that direction. Yeah. So that was great. I learned a lot about, first of all, recognizing the value of, hey, one of the best things you can do about being a community sort of catalyst. I actually don't like the word community. I prefer the word airport. It's like people passing through and meeting each other. Because community has too many deliberate, intentional connotations. This is more like interesting people who like chatting and occasionally cross paths. But the big thing I learned was the more intentional and sort of, I don't know, the ambitious you are about community, the less well it works, because community works best in kind of like a serendipitous mode. Community works best, I think, if it's in your peripheral vision. If it's dead center, you end up creating some sort of grifty, multi-level marketing bullshit scheme. But if community is on the periphery of something else, so in the case of Refactor Camp, a lot of us were simply interested in the same topics, like, you know, how does Silicon Valley work? How does innovation work? How should you think differently about ideas? So community, for the sake of community, was never front and center. It was a few ideas, like, you know, we both use the word legibility, and it's almost become code, because legibility in the word sense we've used it is from James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State. I wrote an article about that in 2011 that went viral, and that's become like a sort of shibboleth or meme currency within the community. And legibility, in the sense we use it, is a way to talk about ideas. So that's the kind of thing I love, which is talk about ideas front and center, communities peripheral. But one of the things that I think was sort of, it wasn't so much a disappointment as it was a wistfulness that it didn't go there. It was like, even though a lot of people had good personal relationships out of that group, and some of them went on to found startups together and so forth, it was like, this is a lot of talking, and it's a little too easy and trivial to start healthy communities that talk a lot. And I was bored of it. It's like, how do you go from like talking and fun meetups and fun events and talks and, you know, salons and all these like talky information exchange things, and how do you get to like actually working together? And that's something I would like to accidentally fall into, just as I accidentally fell into community catalysis. But so far, it's been sort of much harder. Like getting people to come to a meetup or a conference is easy. Getting people committed to do a talk about something they're already doing is easy. But getting 5 people who met for the first time in, say, a Zoom call, but then want to like work together to collaborate on, designing open source rovers,
Mm-hmm.
several orders of magnitude harder, as I'm sure you found out with OpenROV. It's like you can get 100 people to show up for a meetup saying, let's talk about open source ROVs. 10 more people show up to, all right, let's actually have a build party to do something. And then
Mm-hmm.
2 people show up and it's like, fuck, we have to like actually blow a few $1,000s and build something and buy a couple of plane tickets out to the desert and run a rover in real conditions. And it's like the filter from 100 to 1 is.
And just wait till you have supply chains, employees, customers, things like that. Then
exactly.
And you're like,
but I want to see how
do?
far you can go with open organization methods, peer-to-peer production, no commercial intents. How far can you get in this community mode? And I'm pretty impressed with what we've done with the Yak Collective so far. Like the telerobotics stack, it was like Meyer is much more sophisticated about that stuff than I am. And even though like I had the idea of let's do a rover project, I think I'm bringing up the rear of the pack. The other 5 guys on the rover team, they're all doing way better than me because they're like all more experienced at building hands-on stuff than I am. So I'm kind of really excited that, again, this is the beginning of the hopefully serendipitous accidents. It's like, I wanted a rover built, I got a bunch of people interested, and now they're all building better rovers than me. And that's exciting to me.
Well, that's what happened with me. I mean, I like pretty quickly, I was no longer like I was doing the zero to maker thing. And then pretty quickly, I was no longer making anything. I was responding to emails again. And like, that was my whole life. So, it will be interesting to see how long you're able to sustain this. I think I'm going to give you some, I talked about the interface thing as being an important thing to pay attention to because we finally got there and it took us too long. And I wish we would have thought more deeply about that before. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about, and maybe this is going to sound obvious to you, but it took me a long time to focus on this, and now I can't stop seeing it, is this idea of open standards as as a really important vehicle for innovation and affecting change. I mean, you talk about nanosatellites and like you're talking about SpaceX going to Mars. Like to me, the amazing story of space over the past 15, 20 years has been these 2 professors who created the CubeSat standard, right? And created this whole mechanism for students and anybody who wanted to launch satellites and prototype companies or prototype new ways of thinking. I mean, and become a massive customer for SpaceX and all these other launch companies. I mean, but these 2 professors, Bob Twiggs and Jordy, I can't even remember his last name, are like these quiet heroes. And I'm looking around at ocean science. And to me, this next, like the thing that we kind of ran into was like, we couldn't integrate all these like sensors that scientists wanted. And there's all these really expensive sensors that people can't put on these, like there's cheaper platforms coming out and there's cheaper sensors coming out, but the interfaces don't work. Like there's no USB for the ocean. And so now I'm kind of like trying to coordinate this open standard for ocean technology. And coordinating an open standard is a really wild thing, trying to get people on the same page. And so, but I'm actually really convinced that this is the bottleneck. This is the reason that we only have like a dozen vehicles in the world that can go to the bottom of the world's ocean. I think this is the reason that sensors, that we don't have real sensing density in the ocean, I think is this kind of connector bottleneck. Anyways, I just came across this book and I wanted to recommend it. Almost as like a, I know we want to be doing more doing than talking, but I finally found the book on standards and its global standard setting since 1980 or 1880. And it's by a professor of management at MIT, Joan Yates. And it's like finally someone's telling the story of, time and containers and, Tim Berners-Lee and all of these things that I think are these massive contributions to innovation and progress. And they're these not quiet processes, but the heroes in this book, like, are not familiar names.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just trying to draw more attention to standards because I think they're underappreciated. But I also think as you all are kind of going through this, it's not uncommon that these things emerge from amateur scenes. And so just keep that in mind, that like once you find, like, finding the right bottleneck can be like a real opportunity. So just, that's the other piece of advice. I'm sorry for being so long-winded here, is like, keep an eye out for the bottlenecks that nobody else has bothered to solve, because you might find them and be able to solve them in a way that people haven't before. So
I
anyways,
hope so. It's like, yeah, thanks. That's really good advice. And in fact, one of the things I've been meaning to do is have you come join one of our calls, regular Rover calls, and maybe this can be the topic of discussion. Because I think all of us, since we're sort of experienced industry people, mostly 30s, 40s, like I said, or 50s even, we are alive to the importance of standards. And I think I personally am very sort of interested in the history of standards. So container shipping, I'm writing a book about time and clock and timekeeping standards. They're all sort of big on my radar. But the part that you bring up that I think very few people are aware of and good at is actually the process of catalyzing new open standards. Like what we're doing now, like I said, we're building on the Maker Revolution 10 years ago, and the Beagle Blown Blue is an open standard sort of nonprofit board. Raspberry Pi, Arduino, all of them are these open things, and we're sort of unconsciously building on these things. And how can we sort of like perpetuate that culture and do it even better? Like, can we replicate what the CubeSat guys did? And if we end up with a dozen rovers, can we come up with an open rover communication standard or something? So yeah, I think that's
so. But you look at the history of these things. And the Arduino was like a couple of professors who were trying to make it for their students. Same with CubeSats. Like the history of these things they always come from the outside. Like sometimes there's big coordinated industry efforts to create standards like ISO and all these things. Like that happens too. But there are these disruptive standards that come in and kind of level the playing field and let a bunch of new things flourish. And to me, those things always kind of seem to have this amateur orientation, like this kind of idealism around anybody should be able to do this. Let's make it simple and easy. And those are the things that take off. So that's the kind of the other piece of amateurism that I think is really underappreciated.
But it's interesting. It's like the examples you're mentioning and the ones I'm thinking of, many of them came from academics rather than amateurs, but a particular kind of academic who focuses less on research and more on this kind of like community engagement. So weird, like maverick academics. Like one standard I've been thinking a lot about since I do a lot of consulting work with the semiconductor industry is RISC-V. So you've got this sort of late stage semiconductor industry, ARM and Intel and like these proprietary architectures. It's kind of like a mess. And RISC-V is kind of like really exciting. It's like opening up processor architecture all over again. And one of the threads of research that our Rover group is doing is, can we do embedded electronics in RISC-V? And 10 years from now, will space program chips use RISC-V architectures? Like right now, Perseverance is using 1998 era PowerPC standard. So space tech takes like 10, 20 years to harden to, or it takes like 10, 20 years lag from the leading edge Earth-based semiconductors. But can amateurs, for example, lead the way in shortening that cycle? Like, can today's open semiconductor standards get to space in 10 years instead of 20 or 30, right? So I think, yeah, you're right. Super powerful stuff here. And figuring out the cookbook for getting there through like mix of amateur and maverick academic efforts, it's one of the most powerful things that I think may do all the positive things that we're talking about and make them happen. So yeah, and definitely you should come on our weekly Rover calls.
Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, that sounds fun, because I'm looking because it's something that's very top of mind for me, because I'm like I said, I'm working on the social standard, and it's hard to find good like sparring partners for this, or like just thought partners, because it's such a weird thing, and nobody makes money off of them. Like people do eventually, but the people who do them always like just they're forgotten, and they sometimes they're like Tim Berners-Lee. We celebrate them, but I think it's a really rich idea. Okay, cool. So I'm sorry we've been going long, but it's been awesome. The kind of last kind of question I always ask folks is around improving science, because I think science, the institution has kind of gotten kind of stale, and a lot of people are sensing that things could be better. And I'd love to hear what your perspective is on that, what your ideas are to improve science.
Yeah, so we've already touched on a lot of this in the earlier part of the conversation. So in terms of like a couple of like, the problems with grants being the driver and so forth. So yeah, my ideas on how science can be better, I think I should qualify anything I say with anytime somebody presumes to like criticize like the scientific or academic publishing and grant establishment, there's this vague whiff of you're either not competent, or if you're competent, there's like some sour grapes going on. So the competence standard is you don't have a PhD, you've not been in academia, you don't know how this stuff works. Not only do you not understand like advanced astronomy or whatever, you don't understand the institutional structure as well. So that's a way to dismiss one class of critics. The other class is, yeah, you have a PhD, but you don't have a tenure track job. So you're kind of the second rater who fell off the track at some point. The phrase like publish or perish, the hostile reading to somebody like me even having an opinion on how science should be conducted is, this guy got a PhD and postdoc from famous universities, but then failed to land a good tenure track job and ended up in industry and then a blogger. So it's like a steady intellectual downcycling. And to give the devil their due, there's merit to that because there's a lot of that kind of person around as well. Like people who just couldn't cut it, had a higher opinion of their own talents than was merited, and kind of got the right outcome they deserved. Like you didn't deserve to get on the tenure track. You didn't deserve to be a professor at MIT. It's a good thing you like downcycled to industry and eventually as a disgruntled consultant. So I want to like give that criticism its complete due. And on the surface, I look like that. And for the first couple of years, yeah, I was a little bummed after like failing to find a tenure track job I wanted, because I had spent the previous decade, 1997 to around 2007, being groomed for that. Like, series of faculty members, everybody, it's like, yeah, goes without saying, the only respectable, honorable course for somebody in research is publish a lot, win a couple of awards, get a tenure track position at a famous university. That's the only path. And if you go off that path, it's like anything you say has like a question mark and footnotes and like vague side eyes attached to it. But all that said, it's like, all right, so take whatever I say with those caveats in mind. It's like, I enjoyed my PhD, I enjoyed my postdoc. I decided not to do a second postdoc because I would not have enjoyed that. It's like my heuristic has always been my own sort of personal sort of, this might sound like very woo, but I don't know, soulful engagement with what I'm doing is primary. That's why I left my first PhD advisor and signed up with a different guy. It's like, I don't care about the papers. I don't care about my publication record or whatever. First, and like 90% of everything is, am I enjoying and sort of really sort of appreciating what I'm doing? And I would say by that standard, I've enjoyed every step of the way. Like I went from academic research to industrial, and at Xerox, I racked up like maybe 6 or 7 patents, and my contribution to most of them was like very minor. Most of them were like written up by other people. But it's like, again, I enjoyed everything I did at Xerox. I enjoyed the couple of entrepreneurial startup-like things I did. And when I left, it was on really good terms. So that's something I've like made a deal with myself after my first sort of kind of toxic breakup with my first PhD advisor. It's like, either quit the moment bad signs happen, or if you decide to stick it through and like see it through, make sure you exit on good terms with a positive experience. And that heuristic has been good for me. So PhD, great relationship with advisor, exited on good terms. Postdoc, great relationship with advisor, enjoyed my work with students and my research, exited on great terms. Xerox, enjoyed my managers, enjoyed the projects, exited on good terms. And I think that heuristic sort of should be used in sort of assessing your own views when you seek to criticize anything else. Because if your perspective of how you're like looking at something else is not healthy, if it's jaundiced, if it's like full of like unprocessed demons and shadows, not only will people very correctly put question marks next to anything you say, you should not trust what you're thinking and saying either. It's like, if you've not processed your own demons, don't try to process the demons of the institutions you're seeking to criticize. So, so this is a long-winded way of saying, I feel I've processed my own demons in a healthy way. So anything I say about the institutional world, I feel sort of confident that I'm onto something. So I'll say a couple of things. One is I think peer review sucks. Peer review is a fundamentally unhealthy mechanism that is basically an invention by funding agencies to make science legible to them. It's like make it double anonymous, double blind, and have researchers sort of in a slightly hostile way cross-check each other, but in a way that sort of vitiates the collegial positive environment of science. And it forces people into, like my advisor told me that the three things a paper should hit is importance, originality, and correctness. So those are the three things peer review is supposed to check: importance, originality, and correctness. And people get so hung up on originality. And so originality is what, by the way, science funding pays for. They don't care about correctness or importance as much. They expect peer-reviewed scientists to cross-check each other on importance and correctness, but they're only interested in originality because, like any uninformed buyer that's primarily doing bean counting, they don't want to pay for the same thing twice. It's like, hey, we don't want two labs doing the same things unless it's in the structure of an explicit competition. We don't want to pay for replication studies. We don't want to pay for meta-analysis. We want to pay for original science. So you get this unhealthy solving for originality dynamic in academic science. It's like you're doing extremely trivial stuff. You're not doing enough replication. You're not setting up your work to be reproducible and replicable, but you're like striving really hard to make these specious claims of originality. So you get this massive amount of stuff that claims originality is not very important and half the time is not even correct because you're not incentivizing people to check up on each other's correctness through true replication. Like, honestly, in the limited peer review I did for conferences and journals, I'm not happy with the level of scrutiny I put to the papers. It's like I'm attending this conference to which I've submitted a couple of papers and I am sent like 6 or 7 papers in return and I'm supposed to, like, quote unquote, peer review them in like 3 weeks. It's like, and this was, remember, 1998 to 2006, when standards of like publishing your code and data weren't even talked about, much less adhered to. It's like, I'm supposed to read this turgid LaTeX document and have an opinion of whether not just the math is correct, but the simulations are correct and the data is not correct. It's like, yeah, I'm going to give it like a half-hour read, and if there's not any glaring technical errors or derivation errors in the theorems, I'm just going to say, is it original? Yeah, I'm going to sign off. Is it important? Yeah, I'll say your work is important if you say my work is important. Correctness, I just don't have time to check this. So that's how peer review was working when I was part of it. And I was like, this sucks. The way it should work is originality should be at the bottom of the 3 criteria and should not even be really an important criteria. Everybody should do whatever they want, but should do it in an open and transparent way, as open and transparent way as possible. People should get huge credit for trying to reproduce, replicate, and correct and cross-check other people's work. Because as we both know, some of the biggest breakthroughs in science in the last 10 years have not been original research, but people checking up on other people and saying, that's bullshit, that does not reproduce, that does not cross-correlate, that is p-value fishing. So the entire field of social psychology with Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, it kind of imploded on itself as like study after study, including like famous things like ego depletion. It just imploded. It wasn't replicating at all. And I think peer review is a big part of what's to blame for that. And if you had like more open things, and if you look at a lot of this work, a lot of it was much more openly done. It's like, I'm going to like go and try to reproduce these 10 important papers and just blog about it or put it on arXiv. And that's the way to do peer review. So I think peer review needs a shit ton of reform, and it should be about actually checking on science being good and important and original, as opposed to making science legible to the funding agencies. Which means funding agencies should also change their criteria and say, hey, we are actually going to pay for people to reproduce. It's like if somebody sends in a proposal that we are going to go do this massive meta-analysis and try to reproduce these 100 studies, thumbs up, go do it, right? And researchers themselves should kind of like work on that a lot more. So that would be one of my big things. Peer review needs reform to get away from these pathologies. The other big thing I want to sort of take on is there's this sort of in this environment of like inequality and billionaires and so forth, there's this weird antipathy to what I think of as like the uh, nobility level of science. Like, we've talked about how a class system in science, there's rich peers in England doing science in their mansion basements, and they did phenomenal science, by the way. The early pioneers of science came from two groups. One was clergymen who were paid by the church to like sit around, do whatever, and then there were like independently wealthy nobility. These two groups did a lot. And yes, bourgeois science like Victorian hobbyists and what is currently academic bureaucratic science, that's important. Blue collar maker science and amateurs is also important. But I think it's really important to have like a wealth positive attitude to open public science. And if somebody made a ton of money selling a startup or exiting a startup and now has millions of dollars, and instead of spending it on fast cars and yachts and dating Hollywood celebrities, what they want to do is set up a crackpot science laboratory at the bottom of their mansion and blow $1 million on like trying to reinvent the electron microscope. I'm like, we should celebrate that. That's the kind of billionaire and millionaire we should celebrate. And in my own extremely small way, I'm trying to spend the few thousand spare dollars I have to sort of almost. So I draw a lot of inspiration from that crowd, and I joke around on Twitter that I want my own mansion with my own observatory and like 30-inch telescope and $1 million lab. I can't afford any of those things because I'm not an internet billionaire. But in my own sort of petty way, that's my true north. It's like my true north is not like, honestly, it's not developing world science where $100 kit can allow some kid in the slums to do genius level stuff. That's great. Do that too. My standard is also not this kind of like worshipful citizen science where I'm doing like data scut work for academic science. My standard is honestly crackpot rich guy with a mansion and a basement. And I think we need that to be extremely a positive way to do public science.
Hear, hear. Well, here's what I'll tell you, having gone down that path, is it didn't, I don't know that it was a huge like financial windfall to go down that path, but the return for me on interestingness and curiosity and adventure was incredibly high. I mean, we built these tools. We got invited by scientists and curious people all over the world to go on these adventures and see things before other people understood them, got to see them, and just got up to the edge of what humans know in a bunch of weird corners of the world. And that is a really rich experience and a rich life from my perspective. So I think I think it's an awesome goal that you have, and I think you're going to find it to be rewarding in ways that will probably surprise you, and that I hope you continue to do it in public, because I think my big regret now is like I'm trying to communicate that joy and that what we gained. I'm trying to communicate it kind of after the fact almost. And I hope that you and your audience and your way of communicating things will get more people excited about it, because I think it's valuable.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I think a bit openness is one thing, but also being open about things that are normally considered shameful, right? Like it's very noble to do science in like a ivory tower where it's like, oh, I'm this not very well paid academic, but I run $1 billion programs for the good of society. That's, yay, you get lots of brownie points for that. You get a lot of brownie points for trying something like, the one laptop per child or that kind of thing, which, by the way, turned out to be kind of bullshit. It didn't really work out. And the commercial private sector way of doing it actually put a cell phone in every kid's hands. That was a much better model. But that gets a lot of idealistic praise. But what gets it's almost like a kink shaming. It's like, if you actually spend money, especially if you're a billionaire who builds a space program and like Jeff Bezos and goes off to space, it's like, you will be shamed loudly for it. And even at the very modest level, it's like literally what I'm doing as a 46-year-old guy who was kind of a mediocre researcher when I was in academia. And now that I'm not a starving grad student or poor kid in a developing country, I was never poor in India, by the way, should not say that. But in India, these things were hard to afford. Like as a kid, I had very limited hobbyist materials. It's just much easier in the US. But one thing I'm doing, spending money on this at age 46, very publicly, is making up for my lack of skills and intellectual genius with money. It's like, it's okay. Like if ordinary people who are not geniuses choose to spend money and solve their problems with money, like I'm sure a much smarter person than me could have hacked together my lab with like, $10 and a couple of trips to the junkyard because they're geniuses. I know people in the developing world who do things like that. I'm not that kind of genius. And I think it should become okay to not just spend money on this stuff, but not be ashamed of spending money on this stuff and doing so publicly and tweeting it like, haha, I bought this $100 tool and I have no idea how to use it. And here's me with my blooper reel trying to use a Dremel tool for the first time. It's like, this would get you shamed in certain cultures of, oh, this sucks that you're like a middle-aged techie with money to throw, and there's poor kids out there who would benefit from these tools. It's like, no, it should be okay to spend money trying to be a mediocre public scientist. So I want to actually, if that's one takeaway, is like anybody in my position, middle-aged, wanting to tinker, wanting to spend some money on like covering up for your technical shortcomings, do so and like do interesting stuff. Don't get hung up on like, I'm not smart enough to do this. Spend money to buy a tool that's smarter than you. So
I like it. I like it. Cool. All right, Venkat, this was really fun. And I'm looking forward to following along, and I'm going to try and participate as much as I can.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for your own sort of inspiring open ROV stuff. Yeah.
Good.